I will reject all attempts to weaken Canada, all attempts to wear us down, to break us down, so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
We have a lot to do in this country. We have a lot positive to do in this country, building this country in a way, building one Canadian economy.
Just moments ago, Donald Trump exploded in rage after Mark Carney delivered a brutal blow to U.S. trade ambitions, rejecting the deal outright. As tensions rise and global markets react, Carney made it clear, no deal is better than a bad deal. Trump's furious response? Unfiltered and shocking. Here's what just happened. The air in the White House briefing room crackled with tension as President Donald Trump stepped to the podium, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Moments earlier, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had publicly dismissed a U.S. proposed trade deal, calling its terms unfair and politically charged. Trump, never one to back down from a slight, unleashed a torrent of frustration, declaring that Canada had made a huge mistake by turning down what he insisted was a very fair deal. His voice rising, he announced a retaliatory 35% tariff on Canadian goods, targeting key sectors like agriculture, steel, and automobiles. The words landed like a bombshell, sending shockwaves through financial markets and igniting fears of an all-out trade war between two nations long considered unshakable allies. Stock prices in transportation, retail, and agriculture plummeted. The Canadian dollar slid, and oil prices wavered as Wall Street analysts scrambled to gauge whether this was a short-term tantrum or the prelude to a deeper economic crisis. In Ottawa, Carney addressed a somber nation, his tone calm but resolute. Standing before a backdrop of Canadian flags, he explained that the U.S. demands were not only economically lopsided, but also tainted by political motives. A key sticking point was Canada's recent diplomatic recognition of Palestinian statehood, a move that had drawn sharp rebuke from the Trump administration. U.S. negotiators had hinted that Canada's foreign policy decisions would influence trade talks, a pressure tactic Carney flatly rejected. Canada's sovereignty is non-negotiable, he said, his words measured but firm. We will not allow economic threats to dictate our principles. He emphasized that Canada was prepared to weather short-term pain to protect its long-term resilience, even if it meant rerouting exports or seeking new global partners. The speech was a masterclass in defiance, signaling that Canada would not be bullied into submission. Behind closed doors, Trump's economic team was in disarray. Advisors, including seasoned trade negotiators and finance experts, had warned against escalating tensions with Canada, the U.S.'s second-largest trading partner. They pointed to the already strained American economy, battered by inflation and supply chain woes, and cautioned that a trade war could spike prices for consumers already struggling with rising costs for gas, groceries, and housing. Some allies privately urged Trump to soften his stance, arguing that alienating Canada could damage not just bilateral relations but also the broader North American supply chain. Yet Trump remained unmoved, convinced that his hardline approach would force Carney to capitulate. They'll come crawling back, he reportedly told aides, dismissing concerns about collateral damage. His confidence, however, stood in stark contrast to Carney's steely resolve, which suggested Canada was prepared for a prolonged standoff. The seeds of this clash had been sown weeks earlier, when trade talks between the U.S. and Canada showed fleeting signs of progress. Carney had publicly praised aspects of the U.S.-Canada relationship, acknowledging the deep economic ties that see $2.6 billion in goods and services cross the border daily. But beneath the diplomatic niceties, tensions simmered. Canada refused to budge on key issues, including its supply management system for dairy, which limits U.S. imports, and its cultural exemptions. Protecting Canadian media from American dominance, the U.S., in turn, pushed for greater access to Canadian markets while demanding concessions on labor and environmental standards. When Canada's recognition of Palestinian statehood entered the equation, the talks took a sharper turn. U.S. negotiators, emboldened by Trump's directive to link trade with geopolitics, issued veiled threats, prompting Carney to dig in his heels. Trade experts had warned of a breaking point, and now it had arrived with devastating clarity. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Canadian exporters, anticipating U.S. tariffs, began halting shipments destined for American markets. Trucks loaded with lumber, auto parts, and agricultural products were rerouted or held at the border, clogging supply chains and driving up shipping costs. Small businesses in Canada, particularly those reliant on U.S. customers, faced an existential threat. A Quebec-based furniture maker who asked to remain anonymous said, "We're already stretched thin. If these tariffs hit, we're done." In the U.S., retailers like Walmart and Home Depot braced for price hikes on Canadian imports, from aluminum to maple syrup, passing the costs onto consumers already squeezed by inflation. American farmers, still reeling from Canada's recent rejection of $3 billion in dairy exports, faced another blow. Canada, a top buyer of U.S. milk, grain, and meat, was now poised to slash imports, leaving farmers like those in Wisconsin and Iowa staring at unsellable crops and livestock. Financial markets reflected the chaos. The Dow Jones Industrial Average shed 600 points in a single afternoon, with agriculture and transportation stocks hit hardest. The Canadian dollar fell 3% against the U.S. dollar, while oil prices, sensitive to Canada's role as a major U.S. supplier, fluctuated wildly. Wall Street analysts offered conflicting predictions. Some saw the tariffs as a temporary negotiating tactic, while others warned of a cascading crisis that could rival the trade wars of Trump's first term. Trump's supporters rallied behind his tough stance, flooding social media with praise for his efforts to put America first and reduce the $20 billion U.S. trade deficit with Canada. Critics, however, pointed to the mounting costs, higher prices, job losses, and strained alliances, arguing that Trump's impulsiveness was hurting the very people he claimed to protect. Carney, undeterred by the market turmoil, held a second press conference late in the day. His composure stood in sharp contrast to Trump's volatility. "Canada remains open to fair trade," he said, "but we will not accept a deal that undermines our values or our economy." He outlined plans to diversify Canada's trade partnerships, citing ongoing talks with the European Union, Japan, and India. He also pledged support for Canadian businesses hit by U.S. tariffs, including subsidies for exporters and incentives to explore new markets. The message was clear. Canada was preparing for a long fight, betting that resilience and global goodwill would outlast Trump's pressure tactics. Carney's appeal extended beyond economics, striking a chord with Canadians who saw the dispute as a test of national pride. Social media in Canada buzzed with hashtags like #StandWithCarney as citizens rallied behind their leader's defiance. Trump, meanwhile, doubled down. From his Mar-a-Lago residence, he posted a series of incendiary messages on Truth Social, accusing Carney of betraying the U.S. and mocking him as a globalist puppet. The attacks were personal and unrelenting, designed to inflame his base ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. "Canada thinks they can push us around," he wrote. "Under my leadership, America will never be weak." The rhetoric resonated with his supporters, who saw the tariffs as a bold defense of American sovereignty. But political opponents were quick to condemn his approach. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called the tariffs reckless, warning that they would hurt American families already struggling to make ends meet. Economists echoed the concern, noting that tariffs on Canadian goods could add $100 annually to the average U.S. household's expenses, from higher car prices to pricier groceries. The human toll of the dispute was most evident in rural America. Farmers, already battered by trade disputes with China and Europe, faced a grim reality. Canada, which imports $30 billion in U.S. agricultural products annually, was a lifeline for growers of soybeans, corn, and pork. Now, with tariffs looming, that market was at risk. A Minnesota farmer, speaking to a local news outlet, captured the despair. "We are caught in the crossfire. I can't sell my grain, I can't pay my loans, and nobody in Washington seems to care." Dairy farmers, still smarting from Canada's 300% tariffs on U.S. cheese in July 2025, saw the new dispute as a death knell. Many had already resorted to dumping milk or selling cows at a loss, unable to absorb further market closures. The National Farmers Union called for emergency aid, but the White House remained silent, offering only vague promises of future negotiations. The dispute's ripples extended beyond North America. Trump's tariffs sent a message to other nations from India to Mexico that trade with the U.S. came with political strings attached. Countries that diverged from U.S. foreign policy on issues like Palestine, Ukraine, or climate change faced economic punishment. This approach, experts warned, was unsustainable. Trump is weaponizing trade to settle geopolitical scores, said a former U.S. trade representative. It's alienating allies and pushing them toward rivals like China. The European Union, already wary of U.S. dairy imports, signaled it might retaliate with tariffs on American goods, and concerns about market flooding. Japan and Australia, key U.S. allies, expressed unease, with diplomats privately urging Trump to de-escalate. The global trade landscape, already fractured by protectionism and pandemics, seemed poised for further fragmentation. As night fell, the standoff showed no signs of resolution. Trump, buoyed by his base, insisted he would not back down. Carney, backed by a unified Canadian government, signaled the same. The once steady U.S.-Canada relationship, built on decades of cooperation through NAFTA and the USMCA, teetered on the brink of collapse. The 900-mile border, long a symbol of friendship, now loomed as a fault line. Truckers faced delays at crossings, factories idled production lines, and consumers on both sides braced for higher prices. In Detroit, auto workers worried about parts shortages from Canadian plants. In Quebec, dairy farmers feared U.S. retaliation would flood their market with cheap imports, undermining their supply management system. The crisis was not just about tariffs or trade balances. It was a clash of visions. Trump's America First nationalism, rooted in economic leverage and political brinkmanship, collided with Carney's principled multilateralism, which prioritized sovereignty and global partnerships. For Trump, the dispute was a chance to project strength, rallying his supporters by painting Canada as an ungrateful neighbor. For Carney, it was a test of Canada's resolve, a moment to assert independence in the face of U.S. dominance. The stakes were immense. A prolonged trade war could tip both economies into recession, disrupt global supply chains, and erode trust in international institutions. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the uncertainty. In Buffalo, New York, a restaurant owner who sourced Canadian beef faced a dilemma: absorb tariff-driven price hikes, or pass them on to customers already cutting back. In Vancouver, a trucking company laid off drivers as U.S.-bound routes dried up. Families on both sides of the border, accustomed to seamless trade, now faced empty shelves and rising costs. Food banks, already stretched thin, warned of shortages as agricultural trade faltered. The interconnectedness of the U.S. and Canadian economies, once a strength, had become a vulnerability, exposing millions to the whims of political posturing. Analysts debated the path forward. Some saw room for compromise, noting that both leaders had left the door open to future talks. A revised deal with concessions on dairy quotas and cultural protections could ease tensions, but it would require Trump to temper his rhetoric and Carney to navigate domestic pressure to stand firm. Others were pessimistic, warning that Trump's electoral calculus, stoking division to energize his base, made de-escalation unlikely. Carney, too, faced constraints, with Canadian voters rallying behind his defiance but demanding protection for jobs and industries. The USMCA, designed to stabilize North American trade, seemed ill-equipped to handle such a politicized dispute, its dispute resolution mechanisms too slow to address the crisis in real time. The broader implications were chilling. The U.S.-Canada rift threatened to undermine the Western alliance at a time of global instability. With China and Russia expanding their economic influence, a fractured North America could weaken democratic nations' ability to counter authoritarian rivals. The dispute also highlighted the fragility of global trade, already strained by protectionism, climate disruptions, and geopolitical rivalries. Countries like India, watching the standoff, might hesitate to deepen ties with the U.S., fearing similar economic coercion. The rules-based trading system, built over decades, appeared to be unraveling, replaced by a zero-sum game where power trumped partnership. As the day drew to a close, the world watched two leaders locked in a high-stakes gamble. Trump, fueled by conviction and political ambition, bet that economic pain would force Canada to yield. Carney, guided by principle and pragmatism, wagered that Canada's resilience in global alliances would outlast U.S. pressure. Neither showed signs of blinking, leaving millions in limbo. Farmers, workers, and consumers, from the prairies of Saskatchewan to the factories of Michigan, faced a new reality where uncertainty was the only constant. The U.S.-Canada trade war, sparked by a rejected deal and fueled by personal and political animosities, was no longer just a policy dispute. It was a battle over the future of global trade, the limits of power, and the cost of pride. Whether it would end in compromise or catastrophe remained an open question, but one truth was undeniable. The world had changed, and the path back to stability was nowhere in sight.